Now we've got a number of panelists here that you see on the slide. We've got Sounil Yu, who's the CISO-in-Residence at YL Ventures. Brandon Evans, who if you were here earlier in the forum, you saw him present on serverless earlier today. We've got Josh Thurston, who's a prior category leader at AWS, focusing on cloud security. And of course, we have Nathan Case here, senior security strategist at AWS. I'm going to go ahead and invite everybody to turn on your cameras here to let the audience see you. And we're going to go ahead and kick off the panel here. Let's just do a quick sound check. If everybody can unmute yourselves and just go around and say a virtual hello to everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, this is Josh.
All right, excellent. I see Sounil, I see Josh, I see Brandon, I see Nathan. All right, excellent. Nice to have you guys all here. So let's go ahead and dive in with the first question. The way that this is going to work is, I'll be presenting various questions to the panelists here. And, while the question might be directed at one person to start, certainly we are expecting other people to jump on in on that particular question as well. So I want to go ahead and start with a question for Nathan here is, hey, when you're first moving to the cloud, or you're maturing your cloud security capabilities, what do you need to first think about? How should organizations think about this, about cloud governance in this context?
So from my point of view, the best conversations I have, the best interactions I have with a customer, typically with a CISO, as we sit down and they look at me and say, it's time to go to the cloud. What do we want to do? It's that discussion around what is it that you actually want to get out of it. Let's talk about the initial business cases. Let's talk about the initial governance that goes into it. And governance can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. In my opinion, in this particular case, it really means specific things that we have to do as security people, as compliance people, to make sure that what we're doing in the cloud meets our corporate expectation of secure and okay. So it's a lot of talking. It's surprisingly more talking than most people really want to do, I think, probably. There's a lot of let's go do stuff. And I think let's go do stuff is great. But I think we definitely need to pair that with the let's sit down and talk about what the rules are actually going to be, write those down. And believe it or not, yes, I really mean on paper. And then at the end of that, come to a rational way to go ahead and turn those paper rules into something technical. In many cases, Python or whatever else that you're going to go ahead and utilize to do the compliance checks at the very end of this whole thing. Because what we really end up with is this concept of governance at the front that has policies. These policies end up turning into compliance checks. And then we need to make sure that we evaluate those compliance checks back to our governance policies at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. So it really is kind of a chain of things that need to happen in order.
Yeah, while other people are thinking about chiming in here, you mentioned business requirements, right? You're really talking about what are the business goals, objectives, what are the strategic objectives of the organization? What are some examples of that? Do you have an example of that and how that is tied from your high-level policy down to a specific service or implementation?
Well, HIP is a great one. I mean, we can go through that. We've got the whole cyber defense matrix. We've got wonderful people here that would like to talk to you about that, I'm sure. But it really does come down to what are the governance, what are the regulatory pieces, what are the pieces that we're going to decide as a business. That might be encryption at rest, that might be a certain level of encryption at transit, that might be a certain level of, maybe we've decided that we want to go with zero trust types of architectures. Great, totally cool, but we need to write that down so that we can check that in the compliance engine, and then we can also evaluate that from a developer's point of view.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Now you kind of teased kind of one of our other topics here. You mentioned the cyber defense matrix here, and for those of you that don't know, Sounil Yu is the one that has started the cyber defense matrix available online. Sounil, you want to give our audience here just a high-level overview to start of the cyber defense matrix?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a really simple construct. At its core is made up of these two dimensions. On the one dimension, it's the 5 functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And the other dimension are 5 types of assets that we care about: devices, applications, networks, data, and users. And these 2 dimensions create this 5x5 grid. It looks pretty much like a bingo card. Unfortunately, there are no free spaces, but that's it. It's this bingo card that helps us frame the type of activities that we need to perform when we're trying to secure our environment. And oftentimes when it comes to security, the thing that burns us is when we miss something. The thing that burns us is when we forgot to take care of something. And the cyber defense matrix just provides a simple construct to help us. It's a mental model that we can use to ensure that we've covered our bases. And whether it's working with your own environment inside your own enterprise on premise, or you're doing it on somebody else's computer, namely the cloud, it still provides us. It provides a great reference point to be able to say, here are all the things I need to worry about, and here's all the things I need to make sure I cover to have a complete security program.
Great. Hey, Brandon, I want to turn to you here. Sunil just mentioned users, data, networks, applications, devices. What is different in the cloud when it comes to protecting different types of assets?
It's a great question. I think the first way I'll answer that question is a disclosure with regards to my experience. Now, I think that for me, outside of creating a lot of things on a freelance basis, a lot of things that were for small companies, I've had the, quite frankly, luxury of only really developing in the cloud. It's become the norm to me. And it's really where I think most folks who are coming out of school and learning how to develop are really going. So I think that we really need to invest a lot of energy into that, because that's becoming the new normal. Working on premises is not something that's necessarily attracting people out of school. But in general, I think that a lot of the responsibility is taken off of you in terms of creating the services and the tools necessary to secure things like user data and networking. Amazon, Azure, GCP, they all provide a myriad of tools that you can use that were inconceivable prior to the cloud in terms of ways of locking down things. It's really up to you to understand how those services work and how to properly apply the controls that those services provide in order to secure your data, your network, et cetera.
Perfect. Yeah, Josh, I want to turn to you here. What's your perspective? Is how should we be thinking about our cloud defenses, and how does it change the way that we operate?
Yeah, I think that once I had started working with Sunil in previous projects on cyber defense matrix, it changed my view in two ways. One is looking at the capabilities that the end user has to assess for, we'll call it their cyber estate. And moving into cloud architectures, you start thinking of, one of the asset types is device. Well, as Sunil and I start talking about that, what is a device? You move towards it. Fundamentally comes down, it's an operating system with an IP address. So therefore, it could be a physical laptop server, a virtual host, or a cloud instance like an Amazon machine instance or image. And then you start thinking about, well, then what does a container mean to me in the form of an asset? What does a Lambda function? And you start really thinking about your assets and how you categorize them, but then you immediately make that jump to, how do I understand capabilities that I need for that asset as the industry continues to evolve? And so, the customer has to stay up to speed with that. The cyber defense matrix helps. The other thing that I started to pivot and think of differently is, well, if I'm a vendor and I'm creating technology or services, how does this change my perspective? And especially with, if I'm in the product management and engineering space and I wanted to think about, how do I push the envelope further of new capabilities in my product? Well, what better way than go look at it in cyber defense matrix, map out your solution and figure out, here's the area that I don't have capability, but I could easily jump to that and start building out. So I start looking at it through capabilities, and this matrix or grid view is really changed the way that I start addressing security capabilities.
Great. Hey, before we dive more into detail on some of this, I just want to open it up to the audience as well. I did see a couple people, a couple questions come in. Feel free, if you have any questions for the panelists, share them here in our chat window at any time. And to dive a little bit more specifically, we actually do have a question here in terms of what about penetration testing? You know, organizations have been doing pen testing for a long time. And, you know, first, I'm going to have, you know, both Brandon and Nathan here. You know, Brandon, Nathan was just talking about, well, hey, instances, containers, serverless. You spoke about serverless earlier. From a pen testing perspective, kind of what's different about it in the cloud?
A lot of it's different. A lot of it's, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, please, after you.
Okay. There's a lot of differences, a lot of similarities. Fundamentally, our applications are still running on hardware. Serverless does not mean that there are no servers. It means that we pretend that they don't exist or that they are not ours as an abstraction away from us having to manage that. But we still have to understand the different environments with serverless containers, VMs. We need to make sure that the standards that AWS, Azure, GCP are meeting the standards of our organization. But more oftentimes, it's not about penetration testing AWS. I mean, because we probably would find out if there was a critical vulnerability in S3 by now. So many people have had their hands in that cookie jar. But it's usually about how we use those tools, the configurations. I mentioned a couple examples of that in the serverless section. We talked about execution role and the IAM permissions associated with your function. Why should your function be an administrator? The answer is it shouldn't. You should give it exactly the permissions that it needs to access the appropriate resources. So if there is an application security flaw, which once again still matters in any environment, regardless of what maybe some people would like to think, you need to see if that application security issue can be exploited to get those credentials. Now I have access to far more things than I would have otherwise if I was configuring this properly. The same argument goes for network security. The same argument goes for encryption. It's really about your secure configuration. And of course, doing application security in the cloud is no different than on-premise.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in here on this topic of pen testing before we switch gears?
So yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I completely agree with Brandon here. It really is one of those things that you have to keep doing in the cloud. And I get that people think, well, you know, hey, it's a new thing. Maybe we don't have to, or maybe we can get around it. And I know that's totally human nature and we're all there. But the reality is you do need to keep pen testing. I think my favorite hack from last year was a company that had USBs sprinkled in the parking lot. It had nothing to do with the cloud. It had nothing to do with anything else. It was totally a process procedure sort of a thing. And part of pen testing is making sure that all of the things that you have are locked down and you understand the process procedures that are going on in your company. And do you have your USB ports blocked correctly? It's not really the cloud. It will lead to the cloud. And part of that is, you know, kind of understanding the whole chain of events, the whole thing that's going on there. So pen testing is important. Pen testing is good. I would posit that things like Prowler and Scout are, you know, things that should be very common to your developers. I had a developer come to me this week and say, is it okay if I run Scout Suite on my stuff? And I kind of looked at them and went, please run it as much as you'd like. Please help us.
Yeah, and of course, Nathan just mentioned a couple free open source tools, Prowler, Scout Suite, used for looking for security issues and misconfigurations in your environment. So very popular tools, absolutely. Anyone else on the topic of pen testing here? Sounil?
Yeah, I wanted to offer what I think is really useful around pen testing is the challenging of our assumptions, and the red team activities as well. They really are meant to help challenge our assumptions. When it comes to the use of public cloud, if we go in with a perspective that all our assumptions, both explicit and implicit, are still valid, then I think we'll find out pretty quickly that that's not going to be true, right? We'll find that our implicit or explicit assumptions about, let's say, a network perimeter being a foundation for our security controls, that assumption falls apart given the nature of how the cloud is, right? We talk about identity being the new perimeter, but I would argue actually identity's always been our perimeter. We just call it the network identity, namely like an IP address. So now we realize now the network identity doesn't have as much trustworthiness as we used to have, or we used to think that we used to have in traditional environments. So now we have to figure out what can give us more trustworthiness. Or how do we build more trustworthiness into some of these other identities that we can rely upon that help provide some of the controls that we need? And so the whole perspective of pen testing, I think, applies regardless of wherever you are, because ultimately it's about challenging one's assumptions that you come in with. And if you can systematically do that in whatever environment, whether it's cloud, on-premise, or the next new thing, that's going to be an activity that we would want to continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, over the years, I've had a number of pen testing teams, assessment teams, and doing various security reviews. And typically, traditionally, when somebody comes to us and says, "Hey, we would like you to do a pen test," we might scope that out and might take a couple weeks, let's say. So we've got a question that came in here is that, hey, one of the challenges that the person in the audience faces is that with Agile, with modern DevOps practices, is they move faster. And how can the pace or lack thereof of pen testing kind of keep up with this pace of modern development? I'll open it up to the group here.
So I definitely think it's a great question. I think part of it is understanding that doing a full penetration test for every release that an agile team has is simply not possible anymore. You cannot have a full, several week-long penetration test. That doesn't mean you can't build in security controls throughout the pipeline. We talk about this extensively in Sec 540, Cloud Security and DevOps Automation. How do we shift left a lot of these checks? We can do static analysis in the coding pipeline, perhaps not the entire scan, but perhaps an incremental scan where we look at the differences in this deployment other than in comparison to the previous one. And if you do all of these kind of things, dynamic analysis, dependency checking, if you do all of these things, it really lowers the bar for what the penetration testers have to do, because now they're going to focus a lot of their energy on these more complex attacks. And one final thing I'll mention on this subject is I mentioned dynamic analysis. There's also the capability of doing integration tests where you build out acceptance test cases and you test that against your API or your application. So why not automate the findings such that when there's a finding in one of your penetration tests, you build out a script that will validate whether or not that finding has been fixed or not. Now you don't have to have your penetration testers retest previous vulnerabilities. They can focus 100% of their energy on looking at new vulnerabilities. So that will make the effort much faster, but we also have to understand that full penetration tests cannot happen for every release, especially when you have 100, 1,000 deploys a day.
Let me offer even more radical view, if you don't mind. So I was wondering this other day. I was reading Ed Amoroso's post on LinkedIn. He was talking about what makes a good defense, and he said, well, a good defense, we think in some respects maybe a good offense makes a good defense, and he said, no, a good defense is made by a good defense. You have to really focus on the solid principles around how we defend things. I would actually disagree with that view and say a good defense is made by changing the rules of the game. A good defense is by having the attacker have to catch up with us because we keep changing what the rules of the game are. So consider this for a moment. What is happening with every release of a piece of software? We are changing the rules of the game for the attacker. They now have to figure out this new thing that we just rolled out, right? And suppose we do that constantly, repeatedly, and as much as possible, that application changes, not because we're trying to defeat the attacker, but because we're trying to drive business value, right? If you were an attacker and you had to constantly keep up with this latest change, latest update, latest whatever, it'd be maddening because you thought you got something and all of a sudden now the application has changed. Now, where the application doesn't change are your potential weak points, because now the attacker has time to go and probe it and figure out what's going on. But so do you then, right? At that point, you have a chance to fully penetration test it and see, are there weaknesses in some of these core parts that maybe may not change very often? And so that's another way to look at penetration testing. I wouldn't penetration test those things that, again, are constantly changing, because honestly, it's going to be really hard for the attacker to even catch up. And you don't want to slow the business down in those situations. I think it's important that they, for business sake, but also in many ways, again, what makes a good defense is one that where you're again constantly changing the rules of the game, and the attacker has to catch up and play and understand those rules of the game. And when that's happening, I think that's actually perhaps one of the best defenses that we have in our disposal.
Yeah,
And
excellent.
oh, and I should say, and cloud secure and cloud the cloud public cloud environments are really well suited for that because it enables us to change the rules of the game constantly, and that's we should use that to our benefit.
Yeah, excellent.
And
It's
to
not
add
just-
on to that, sorry, to add on to that, one of the ways you can change the game is simply retire applications that you're no longer using. That's a big thing that a lot of folks don't do, which is tear down things. And the cloud also helps enable that. That's a way of reducing the attack surface at the same time as changing the.
Yeah, I was just about to unmute and say, the change in making everything more ephemeral is really the dynamic nature of the cloud is making it harder for the adversary because now things are boom, come and go. And it's that agile development that you mentioned earlier, Brandon. It's just changing all of that, and the security guys are able to use newer tools like cloud security posture management, cloud workload protection platforms that help them keep pace. But the adversary doesn't have that luxury to keep pace. So it's really starting to tilt the scales, in my opinion.
And I think to add to that, like when you look at the things that you can do in any cloud, I mean, obviously I've got my own AWS side of this whole thing, but API gateway and other API management systems, it's really interesting when you start shifting things that are, you used to run it on a specific open source piece of software and there were known issues with that. But if you can switch it to the left just a little bit, it's interesting how your architecture suddenly becomes more secure. So like I was talking to a developer this week even, and he was building out a whole EC2 cluster with open source web server and this really whole complex thing that looked just like we would have built it in a data center. And he had all of these things that he hadn't planned for. He hadn't thought about DDoS. He hadn't thought about WAF. He hadn't, just the whole list went on and on and on. And I literally just went ahead and picked it up and put it in Fargate and then put API gateway in front of it and went, and we're done. But if you haven't thought about it from like architectural points of view all the way through and thought about the things that you have to do when we come back to governance, and not to like bring this whole thing back around, but if you haven't thought about it from a governance point of view, the things you have to have, you get to this point where somebody starts building something and they like what they've built, and you may not have a way to argue to them or convince them that, hey, there's a more secure way to do this. This is the way we suggest you do it.
Yeah.
So
a few moments ago, Sounil mentioned, hey, maybe some people might say identity is the new perimeter, but Sounil points out that, hey, maybe the network identity has been the identity perimeter for the whole time, albeit a simplistic one. So let's go back to first principles here a little bit, and maybe start with Sounil and go around. Is how does the cloud enable defensible infrastructure? What are those principles in terms of what it means to actually be defensible?
Sure. Yeah. So Josh actually mentioned this briefly in one of the principles I consider. When I've been thinking about defensible infrastructure, again, I talk about changing the rules of the game as a part of that. But there's also another perspective around how do you engineer towards defensible infrastructure? And we traditionally would think of defensible infrastructure or security in the context of the CIA triad. We aim for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But honestly, I mean, I'm a security guy. I understand those principles, but I'm not sure exactly if I can set a very clear goal of saying, okay, now this is fully confidential. Okay, whatever this thing is, or this thing has full integrity. What are the benchmarks or the measurements I can put towards that? And it's still very squishy, right? So I came up with a different triad. We have the CIA triad, and then I have what I call the DIE triad. DIE stands for distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. Distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. And those are actually very measurable. I can measure ephemerality. How long-lived is something? I can measure immutability. Has it ever changed? Well, anything greater than 0 means that it's changed. Therefore, you violate immutability. Let's try to avoid that. And then distributed, again, that can be something that's moves towards infinity, but nonetheless, you can say how distributed is the service or this component that I have. And what's really cool is that when I think about defensible infrastructure, if I build towards DIE, that actually sets the foundation for what is more defensible. Fortunately, I think the public cloud provides that as a core set of propositions around how you build defensible things inside the cloud. You build them to be distributed. You build them to be immutable. You build them to be ephemeral. And if you've heard of the pets versus cattle analogy in the cloud native world, DIE is meant for cattle. You build cattle to be like to be distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. Conversely, if you have a pet, then you have to CIA it. Okay, you have to practice the principles of CIA because you can't lose that pet. And if you're going to put that pet in the cloud without the proper set of controls, that pet's going to get run over, and you're going to have a bad day. And people are emotionally attached to that pet, and so the just being sure that you understand the fact that you're putting this pet in harm's way. If you don't put the necessary protections around that pet in the cloud, then again, that's not gonna, you're not gonna have a great outcome.
I love your acronym, and I think it's incredible. But I do want to add something to it that definitely doesn't make sense in the acronym sense, which is short-lived. DIEs, that doesn't sound nearly as good. But like Nathan said before, you know, having sorry, I got myself mixed up. That was one of your principles. I meant less infrastructure,
ephemerality.
less ephemerality set. I'm sorry, I got all mixed up. L, less infrastructure. I want less infrastructure. Instead of having all these EC2 clusters, like Nathan said, have less. Take down infrastructure that you're not using. Take off applications that you're not using. Have serverless functions where it's plausible to have less long-term systems, and that would immediately lend itself to the DIE triad as well. So I don't know how you can rename it to fit that idea, but you need less infrastructure. It's just not as catchy, unfortunately.
Maybe we change it to DICE, distributed, immutable, consolidated, and ephemeral. We'll call it the DICE quadrant.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can dice up. I guess you can dice up cattle, but it still sounds weirder than just die cattle.
Hey, the best hamburgers are made with sacred cows.
That's right.
Yeah, and we're really talking about reducing the attack surface here, and kind of going back to the concept of attacks. One audience member here posed a question. Interesting question here is back to that idea of constantly changing the apps. Is things are ephemeral. Infrastructure as code enables this, and modern development practices and containers enable this. But let's say that the adversary is an AI that someday maybe can deal with the speed and volume of change. Is, you know, hey, what about that potential future scenario? What do you guys think?
I think the last of our problems will be cybersecurity at that point. But that said, it is a some degree of war of escalation, right? And ultimately, it's again mind versus some person coming up with creative ways to do things, and somebody else trying to find a way to counter that creativity, right? And it's a back and forth discussion that goes. Actually, the one principle I would apply, and I'm trying to think of the original quote, but it was something like this: with all your cleverness, if you program something with all your cleverness, it takes twice that cleverness to find bugs and flaws in it. Okay, so that's what I would hope for. That over time we will essentially continue to increase our own cleverness by being on the offense ourselves in terms of creating these new things. And as long as we continue to push the boundaries of that, then it'll be hard for anybody to catch up, let alone an AI.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that quote. It actually reminds me of another quote that almost leads us to a very different conclusion, which is that clever code makes for clever bugs. So oftentimes, a lot of the security vulnerabilities come about from a company doing something that seems clever at the time, but in reality, it is a hack. But I completely agree with you that I don't see why it would be that AI would be able to attack faster than we can defend. And I am frankly extremely skeptical that AI can do either of those two things in a meaningful way. We are not replacing developers with AI. We can barely replace some of the developers who retire or leave companies with other developers of the same skill set. It's just a very hard problem to solve. So if someone can make an AI that can attack, I'd be very impressed. I'm sure it'll eventually happen, but I think that a lot of it will be overblown as well. AI is scary in principle. In reality, it rarely manifests itself into anything of that magnitude.
I would weigh in that I think Sounil is probably right here. If we go down this path, and Brandon too, I suppose. I mean, cyber defense means something totally different at this point. Let's be honest. We're playing Terminator for real. But when we get down this path, and it's a fun mind game, you know. Or what happens if we have, you know, AI that can attack? Well, then most likely we'll have AI that can defend, and, you know, again we go back to stalemate. So I think that we go back to the principles again. Like, okay, cool. So now we have a faster attacker and we have a faster defender. Great. But I expect the meat in the seat, us, to still be the weak point in all of those expectations, right? I mean, like, we are the weak point that an attacker will attack first. There's a reason that ransomware has seen a rise. There's a reason that all of these things, I mean, I told the joke about the USBs in the parking lot. There's a reason that people still use USBs in the parking lot. I still use USBs in the parking lot as a red teamer. I will write Mikey's homework on the USB, and sure enough, someone will plug it in because they really need to see Mikey's homework. It's truly just the human nature that drives us that is really the weak point in all of this. So I'm really happy that you've got an AI attacker, and I'm really happy that you've got an AI defender, but it's so much easier to go after Brandon and you know, send him an email.
Hey, great conversation, guys. While we wait for some additional questions to come in, I did want to switch topics here a little bit. You know, throughout the day, we've heard some info from other speakers about the AWS Marketplace and solutions available there. So, Josh, I want to, you know, I know that you've got some background in this area, and, you know, you go to AWS Marketplace or any app store type of thing for that matter. You're just a lot of different options, a lot of different solutions. You know, how should organizations be thinking about, well, when to use a cloud native solution versus the vendor provided solution versus, you know, looking for the right tool in someplace like AWS Marketplace? What's your advice?
Yeah, I think rule number one is you gotta really get back to understanding your capabilities. You know, what are you looking for? You know, what is your use case and the outcome that you're dare I say chasing, right? So it comes down to, you know, simple examples like, you know, can I identify all of the assets? Can I pull active or a passive inventory of all of my, you know, instances, applications, containers, networks, flows, users, etc. And you work through all of these. You will find in so many cases that through the very large, I think it's 180 plus AWS native services, you will get a lot of the capabilities out of them. The key is that when you look towards meeting those capabilities with AWS, when you start to look at the vendors that are in there, you start getting the 1 + 1 actually equals 3, because they start giving you more efficiencies and more control or more structured visibility. Things like, hey, I can go grab event data out of something like Security Hub, but if I take Security Hub data and put it into an industry's you know, newer SIM, now I have maybe more advanced correlation aggregation, and I can bring in data, and I have a different type of insight where the Security Hub was good, but now we go and say, now we're great. We can really see the proverbial needle in the haystack and meet something more than just compliance. You can also get into other, you know, really good examples like taking all of these native events out of, you know, the applications, the containers, the instances, and you can consume those. The data is there. Use those native services to extract the data. But when you go and put them into an EDR solution or like a UEBA solution, you're taking it up, that extra notch. So I always encourage people, look at the native services as the ability to get quicker, dare I say cheaper visibility and access, but use these third-party solutions to take it up to that next layer or that next capability set to really drive efficiency and get closer to that perfect scenario of protect and detect, and then move into the recover and respond and recover. Excuse me.
Other comments before we move on to the next topic here?
I will say that I think there's a huge trend in developers, operations, et cetera, to try to stay in one ecosystem if they can manage it. And I think AWS has done an amazing job from a psychology perspective in getting folks in that area. If there is a cloud native solution that works, why not stay within the same ecosystem? So I think it's great that AWS is investing further into promoting those third-party solutions and saying, hey, there are things that we simply are not going to specialize in. We have 175 plus services. There are other companies working full-time on this one area, and we'd like to promote them in the context of our marketplace. So I think that's phenomenal.
All right, so in terms of switching topics here, let's switch gears and let's talk about China. So I think we may all be familiar with the fact that China has a Cybersecurity Act, that one of the things that is maybe unique compared to some other parts of the world is that they have a data residency requirement, right? At a high level, they say that, hey, important data and systems need to be reside in China proper itself, within the border. So the audience member's question here is, hey, between public clouds that are for the most part available in most of the world, well, how would you compare that with what is available in China? What do we need to think about for us in organizations that have to do business in China versus the rest of the world?
I'll speak to that short bit. I can't say I am a subject matter expert on doing cloud in China. We actually had 2 SANS webcasts recently in which you can get a lot more information on this, one by Ken Hartman and one by Tim Coakley. But I wouldn't say that these are competing things, because AWS can be run in China. There is a China region for AWS, and I don't think people are really recognizing that or fully utilizing it. Is it as feature rich as the other ones? No, but the same thing could be said about GovCloud. And there is clearly Alibaba is the winner in that area, but there are instances in which these public clouds have made their way into China. Google, I believe, has also made some strides in that area.
Yeah, the way that I've always characterized this problem is by framing my test case or my use case for what I would want from a set of security capabilities that I've yet to actually see in the market, but this is what this is my test case. So I would want to run the most sensitive transactions, financial transactions, whatever, okay, on Russian bulletproof hosting. All right, give me the most the worst possible place to run my my workload, and I would want that workload to remain secure, regardless of where it lives. Right, that's the goal. Actually, to go back to my the pets versus cattle analogy, we have a lot of data pets, okay, and we haven't figured out actually a way to elegantly turn them into data cattle instead. And that's what I think that's the challenge or struggle that we as an industry are still trying to figure out how to do. Today, we only know how to operate with data pets. And as a result, when you put a pet in China, it's subject to be compromised. It's subject to be lifted. And the same can be said by people outside the United States who are looking at the US and saying, well, you put your data pet in the US and the NSA is going to snarf it up. So regardless of what country you're in, I think the goal that we would want to try to strive for is to look at ways that we can potentially do the same type of transactions, but not have to always give up our pets in doing so. What we would rather have are techniques that allow us to interact with data cattle, just as much as we have data servers as cattle. applications as cattle, containers as cattle. We haven't really figured out how to make data cattle. And interestingly enough, though, there's a whole set of new technologies that I don't know if a lot of people have really gotten familiar with, but ironically, the acronym for this set of technologies is called the name of these technologies is called Privacy Enhancing Technologies, or PET. But anyway, these privacy enhancing technologies, I think, are a way that we can start figuring out how do we operate with data cattle instead of data pets. So these are things like multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, trusted execution environments, differential privacy, federated learning. All these are different things that we can use to actually operate with data cattle. But we haven't really figured out how to do that well yet. And I think we've figured that out for a lot of things like infrastructure, but we haven't figured it out. A lot of people are still trying to figure out how to do that with data itself. And once we figure that out, I think this problem that we have with China, I don't think it'll completely go away, but it will certainly reduce our exposure significantly, such that we will feel comfortable in operating in some of these potentially more hostile environments without fearing that we're going to lose our pets every time.
Yeah, very well said. Any other thoughts on that, folks, before we move on? Now, we've had a pretty friendly panel here so far, despite some perhaps efforts to get things riled up, and so it's always good to have something a little bit perhaps maybe incendiary. So we do have one audience question here. Hey, everybody, the panel, what are your thoughts about the FireEye incident this week?
All right, well, let me offer my soundbite on this. I think it's like, so if it were Russia or some nation state actor, I think it was, I would think they would be disappointed. It's like using your most sophisticated tool to go and steal a set of lockpicks that you can buy at Home Depot.
Yeah, stole some open source tools.
Yeah. Now, granted, there were having done an analysis, there are three. There's a small handful of known exploits that weren't available in the wild, and maybe they picked up those. Okay. I wouldn't be surprised if the ones that they picked up were ones they already had, right? So again, breaking into high security facility only to steal a set of lockpicks that you can buy at a common store. So, but that's it. I certainly, there's some comparisons that I'm seeing towards this being like the biggest hacks in shadow brokers, or like stealing nuclear launch codes. I'm like, no, it's so far, and based on the evidence so far, it's nothing like that.
Mm-hmm.
I would just offer this up as someone who's formerly managed security operations for a security software vendor, high profile, big name in the industry. It pains me to see all of the stuff going across Twitter and LinkedIn where everybody just feels like it's time to double down and bash on them and say, oh, you're a security company and you couldn't keep yourself secure. The job of securing your company is hard pretty much no matter what organization you're protecting, whether you're a financial institution, healthcare, the list goes on and on. When you're a security vendor, in my personal opinion, you actually have more attacks than a lot of the organizations, because the holy grail is, breach government, breach, financial institution, breach the security vendors. So you see a very high volume of attacks. And we all know that being able to say we're secure that's a day in and day out thing, right? And there's always a way in. So what we need to do as an industry is be supportive of these security vendors, because it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, and just happens to be this is their time that something happened. We all need to support them. We need to lift them up, and we need to rally around them to figure out how can we all learn from this and how can we all move forward to get better at security as a larger industry.
And to add on to that real quickly, I think FireEye has done a great job of setting a new bar for the kind of disclosure that we would all want to see.
I think it's important to realize here that it was a security company that got popped here. I mean, as we look at this, I think it should be, what's the best word for this? I think it should be humbling for the rest of us to go, oh wait, they do this for a living and they got it. What are we doing? You know, what tabletops have you guys, has anyone done this month? What technical, you know, attacks have you done against your own systems? What chaos engineering have you looked at? What have you? I know that when I get into a lot of my customers, when I go talk to them, the first thing that comes up is, well, what is this Simian Army stuff? Is this any good? And a lot of it's really funny, but you get into it and you go, well, you know, have you even done a tabletop? Have you done a tabletop to let's sit down and talk about what happens if? And I think I completely agree with Josh. It seems like we like to bash on people like it's high school. And the reality is that, you know, it's going to happen to everybody. And we need to sit down and deal with that fact. And part of that is getting ready for it. And the preparation is every day of the week more important than what happens on that day.
Yep.
Spent the first 4 years of my career here at AWS doing incident response. And it is never a happy morning. It just isn't. But the customers, and there are few that get ready for it and deal with it and have been prepped and ready and trained for it beforehand, always deal with it infinitely better.
Yeah, so much for an incendiary conversation. It seems like we're all on the same page about this. Things happen to even those who are very well prepared. I talked about Capital One and the incident that happened last year that related to an instance metadata service. I briefly mentioned that during my talk. And Capital One has done amazing things for both DevOps and security, amazing things. And they still had an incident in which they were attacked in such a complicated way. And to further add to that, I remember Bruce Schneier, who's one of the most famous security people out there. He did a keynote for LinuxCon 2015. And in that, he mentioned that recently he had gotten phished. Now think about that. Think about someone like at the highest level of security getting phished. It just shows that this is a human element. There are going to be mistakes that are made. So I don't think it's surprising at all that security companies are facing security threats. Everybody does, but they're probably thinking about it more than you are. So really redouble your efforts, just like Nathan mentioned.
All right, hey everybody, great discussion, great questions so far. We're coming up on the end here. So I want to go around here and give each of you an opportunity to share with the audience kind of what's your one takeaway is, hey, when they go back to work tomorrow, later today, what should they be thinking about from a cloud security perspective? Josh, I'm going to go ahead and start with you.
So from a cloud perspective, I think that there's been this continuous misnomer of I moved to the cloud, therefore I'm not safe, or then there's the other contrast that I moved to the cloud, therefore I am safer. And I think that you need to think of security as a whole and not just say, well, I've moved to the cloud. You need to look at it as I've extended my estate. My estate is no longer in a hosting provider, a colo. It's not in my on-premise data center. I'm actually just extending to this place called the cloud, and immediately go back to revisiting the capabilities. And you might have different capability needs because of how you've extended your estate, but always come back and think of it. This is a big, huge thing that I'm protecting. Go through your iterative process. I need to identify my assets, understand vulnerability, risk. How do I secure them? How do I measure? How do I get back to, start? The first is I have to re-identify. Excuse me. So I think that so many people come in and they say, oh, we're moving to the cloud and now we're not having to secure XYZ. No, it's still there. You still have to go through this iterative process. Don't ever stop. It's a day in and day out nebulous thing. And you just have to be vigilant every single day.
All right, great. All right, Nathan, up to you next. Still on mute, Nathan.
Closing statement after a statement like that from Josh is harsh. I would tell you that, going back to the statement we talked about, preparation is worth so much more the morning of an incident. I think that's really important. looking at your architectures prior to understanding the types of risks you're facing and being honest about it is important. And I would say that the governance thing that we talked about way back at the beginning, and I know that was like 30 minutes ago or whatever, but so many customers get into this concept of we're just going to rush into the cloud, and they make the exact same mistakes they made in the data center. This is so the moment you have to do this the right way, to go back to zero, to plan it out, to execute correctly. Take the opportunity. Go as slow as you need to go to get it done right.
All right, excellent. Brandon, you're up next.
Certainly. So I think when it comes to the cloud, we fundamentally need to understand that security is different. It's not necessarily harder. It's not necessarily easier. It's different. You get so many benefits from being in the cloud. You get to lean on the shared responsibility model. You have all of those capabilities we mentioned earlier with IAM and networking and encryption, all these managed security services, and they're incredibly valuable to your organization. But there's also a lot of new challenges that we're not nearly as familiar with, such as insecure default configurations. Because, hey, we're not building out this platform. We now need to understand how to properly secure it based on their documentation. There's a lot of documentation there. There's also a lack of understanding of cloud platforms under the hood. How do they actually work? And of course, there are compliance concerns potentially depending on what industry you work on, due to the fact that you're fundamentally sharing private data with third parties like Amazon. That is an inevitable part of working with the cloud. So I believe with the right resources, organizations can operate as securely, if not more securely, in the cloud as opposed to on-premises. And because I think that there is a lack of resources out there and it needs to continue doing research in that area, that's why I'm just so proud to be a part of the SANS Cloud Security Curriculum.
Now I'm still on mute here. All right, Sounil, thank you. Thank you, Brandon. Sounil, up to you.
Cattle in the cloud, pets on-prem. Thank you.
Awesome. I love it. I love it. Hey, everybody, thanks for attending the very first Cloud Security Forum here with SANS and AWS Marketplace.